Hello! Welcome to the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast, where we dive into the connection between the land, the sea, and us. Here, field stories reign supreme and life experiences are divulged. I'm your host, Kara Muzia. Let's dive into today's episode. Have you heard about my free program, Back to Nature? Getting outside is vital to our health and the health of our planet. The cool part is, to reap the benefits, you only need a few minutes a day. This course is designed to be fun and easy to do, and perhaps spark an adventure or two. Click the link in the show notes to get started today, or visit karagracemuzia.com. Hello, mermaids, pirates, ocean lovers, and land lubbers. Welcome to today's show. Did you hear about the guy who lost the fishing competition? He was really upset. He was acting totally out of line. Why are fish such terrible journalists? They always spread hate news. Joe Meisel is a scientist committing to protecting wild places and educating curious people. As a biologist, he has worked for 25 years with the Ceiba Foundation for Tropical Conservation, where he gets to study plants such as orchids, the ocean, and share the fascination through study abroad programs. Growing up in the American Midwest, Joe was a long way from the sea. Through following his own fascinations, Joe found himself working in the tropical Americas, co-creating a foundation, and ultimately teaching and writing a book on marine science. Joe also speaks on what it means to hold space for both the threats our world faces and simultaneously enjoy and reveling in the world that we live in. So stay tuned to the end of the episode for that. Please enjoy. Joe, welcome to the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast.
Wow, thank you. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
I was on your foundation that you work for's website, and you posted in August how you just came back from Belize and taking students to the second largest barrier reef in the entire world. Would you share a little bit about what that is like and what topics you cover look like, and just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Everybody should go to Belize and see the second largest Great Barrier Reef, or largest barrier reef. The largest barrier reef in the world, of course, is the Great Barrier Reef. Everybody knows that one. You can see it from space. It's the biggest thing on the planet that's been created by animals that are tinier than your thumbnail. But the second biggest one is off the coast of Belize, called the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef. And it's sort of similar. It's where a drop-off kind of occurs. So on the land side, it's a few hundred feet deep, or much shallower when you're close to islands. And then on the sea side, on the Caribbean side, it drops to maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet of depth. And it runs all the way down. That's sort of the curve of Central America. So it runs from that kind of southeastern part of Mexico, kind of Cozumel and those areas, which are also famous for corals, and then passes all of Belize and kind of curls where Honduras starts. So it's amazing. I mean, on the interior side, there's a whole bunch of islands. And so Belize is very famous for all these little islands. Some of them have mangroves and are breeding places for sharks and sea turtles and rays. Manatees can be seen there too. And then when you get further out, you start to get to these kind of patch reefs. And so I guess by way of background, I teach a lot of study abroad programs. We lead people to Ecuador, but also on a coral reef ecology course to Belize. So we take students from the United States, and we hop in a boat on the coast of Belize, and you start going, over the flat kind of calm seas, and the students are like, God, it's kind of wavy out here. And you're like, oh, you have no idea. And then you kind of keep on going. And about 10 miles later, you get to the edge of the first barrier, and you cut through that, like typically around Tobacco Key or something. And then you're into the deeper water where the swell is, taller than your head, and it goes up and down, and people are like, oh, I get what you mean, And then you go another 15 miles or something like that. I think it's 25 miles in total. And you reach the edge of the Mesoamerican Reef. So all of a sudden, if you were flying a drone or in a plane, it looks that classic Caribbean turquoise blue because there's white sand underneath it. And then a quarter mile to your right, it's deep, dark, almost black blue because it's so deep there. And we go to a place called Glover's Reef Atoll, which is a big giant atoll, like a sunken old island with a whole bunch of coral patches in the middle of it. And yeah, students spend 2 weeks there. We do little research projects, teach them underwater skills, fish identification, how to snorkel, and how to collect data underwater, and also how to enjoy like an awesome time on a great reef.
Growing up, did you think that this would be your job? This is what you would do, is get to go travel to these amazing locations and teach people this?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I always liked nature. I'm actually born in Atlanta, and I grew up going to some of the forests to the north of Atlanta, mostly in Tennessee. And so weekend trips, in a VW bus with my parents. And so weekend trips were always really fun. And I spent my summers too in a place in sort of southern Illinois near St. Louis called Piasaw Chautauqua. That's also a very outdoorsy kind of place, like running around in creek beds and looking at frogs and stuff. But that's all real far from an ocean,
Yeah.
So I never really thought about it that way. I mean, I will say that in Chicago, so I mostly grew up in Chicago, and I grew up in Lincoln Park, so near Lincoln Park Zoo, which, if you don't know, is a really great public zoo. It's free, you just walk right in. So even as a little kid, it's 3 blocks from my house, and we just walk over there. And when you would first walk into the zoo, to the right-hand side, there's a big pool that has sea lions and penguins in it. And I would just stand there as a little 8-year-old or whatever, looking at these things like, oh, that's so cool. So I'm from the Midwest, and it's looking through this glass, front of the outdoor pool, looking at these things. And little me, I remember distinctly thinking, well, if I jumped in there, first of all, how fun would that be, like swimming around with the penguins and the sea lions? And I wonder how long, it would take me before the great arm of the law would like grab the back of my shirt collar, haul me dripping and flapping, out of the water. So that was sort of always in the back of my memory. And then a bunch of years later, right after I got my PhD in biology and stuff like this, I started leading student groups to lots of places, but in particular to Ecuador. We take them to Galapagos. And there was a day when I got in the water in Galapagos off of Isabela Island with a bunch of students. And I looked to my left, and there was a Galapagos sea lion that came swimming by. And I'm like, oh, that's so cool. They're pretty common, so you see them underwater, but it's awesome. And then I looked to my right, and this whole flock of penguins came swimming by. And there was a part of me that was like, it's actually happening. Like, it's right now, So I can't say that little 7-year-old me looking at the pond, at the pool, thought that I would be doing this in the future. But anyway, that's what's happening now.
Yeah, full circle moment for you.
Yeah, no, it was great. I got up. I was so excited. I got out of the water. I'm telling all the students, like, you can't believe this. They're like, yeah, whatever.
So what made you decide, when you were looking at school options and what you wanted your future to be like, that this is what you wanted to study, is to study the natural world?
Like I said, I was always interested in nature. And so I thought about being a veterinarian and then biology, and I got really interested in biology. But I also always, for a long time, really enjoyed traveling and languages and like learning about foreign cultures. And so I had done a fair bit of work in South America as a volunteer and an intern. I was stationed in Paraguay not stationed, that sounds like I was with the military or the Peace Corps. I was just living in Paraguay for a while, working with an organization there called Fundación Moisés Bertoni, and they were tasked with establishing the national park system for a country that didn't have one. And it was a bunch of people, some of whom had college degrees, but some of them hadn't even graduated from high school, but they were all super dedicated, really enthusiastic and hardworking. And so I came out of that and moved to your state, to Florida, to start school at the University of Florida in Gainesville in what's called the Tropical Conservation and Development Program. And I carried that with me at the time, thinking, here's a bunch of people who don't have the luxury or even the time, or maybe even bothered to go to graduate school, to get a master's degree, to get a PhD. I mean, some of my cohort were like, well, I'll go and get a postdoc, and then I'll publish some papers, and I'll do another postdoc, and eventually I'll start making a contribution. And I'm thinking, man, these people in Paraguay are making this incredible contribution, like right now, just energy and a small amount of finance. So long story short, but out of that idea grew the foundation that I founded with a bunch of friends. That's called the Ceiba Foundation. And that's the organization that I work for. We lead the field courses. We also do conservation work. So that founding that organization was sort of that little culmination of, I really enjoy biology. I really want to learn more about nature, show people about nature, protect nature, and do it in places that are a little bit far flung. I just have kind of a taste for the exotic or whatever. So it was fun to be able to speak Spanish all the time and work in Central and South America. So that's kind of where that all started.
Yeah. I'm really curious, what prompted you to go to Paraguay in the first place? You said this is like the step before school, which I love. You're like, I'm going to get experience, some real world application, and then decide.
Yeah, no, I mean, I graduated undergrad at the University of Virginia. A bunch of friends of mine and I were in a band, and we're like, let's move to Madison and be in a rock and roll band. So we did, and that didn't really go anywhere, but it was tons of fun. And then I was like, well, I should probably get back to being somewhat serious. And so this is like, back in the hazy, distant period of time before there was even the internet, right? So I did this big long trip, but before I went, I had a list of a ton of organizations in Central and South America of their actual addresses. And so I wrote like handwritten letters with pen on paper and sealed them up in my little envelope and went to the post office and got stamps for all these different countries, And then I went on this big long trip. And when I came back, I had a stack of letters that had come back from all these places. It was awesome. I mean, I recommend that anybody do this, right? Write to an organization somewhere in the world and see what you get back. Like, it's fun to get letters in the mail. And a bunch of them were cool. They were like, we want somebody to help translate our newsletter into English, or, they were interesting and cool places. But the one in Paraguay was like, well, we have to plan the national park system and we need help. And I was like, okay, I'm sold. I had to look up Paraguay. It's like, oh, that's the landlocked one. Like, they don't have any connection to the ocean, them in Bolivia. And it's a super interesting country, but I don't know anything about it. So I was just like, all right, that sounds like a great mission. And I already spoke a little Spanish, but not much. And so I learned a lot when I was there. And again, I got really inspired by the tropics, and not by the ocean at that point. They don't have any ocean, but by tropical land anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So being there and being entrenched in all of, you said all these go-getters, these people that are like, I don't need a degree and all this, I'm just doing the thing. What prompted you to actually come back and pursue higher education in form of graduate schools?
I sort of felt like I had wanted to already. I already had kind of the inkling of the idea. And certainly by the time I got into master's, I was pretty secure about the idea that I wanted to be able to lead my own research, lead my own organization, and to teach at a university level. I wasn't sure if it was going to be in a university or out, which is what it turned out to be. But I figured I probably want to get a PhD for all those reasons. So I had planned to go to graduate school anyway, and then was just getting experience and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I think on the basis of all that experience, it made for a very natural segue into this program called Tropical Conservation and Development at Florida. And it was cool because in those years, TCD, that's the program, was trying to have about half of their cohort. I think there were about 40 of us in total. About half their cohort was U.S. students interested in the tropics, and the other half were Latin Americans. Mm-hmm. So we had scholars that were coming up from Ecuador and Costa Rica and Mexico and all these places. And so we formed like a really interesting group together where you got to learn from a lot of different people, had a lot of very nice real world connections. There was a soccer game that started. We play soccer. I still play soccer with two of those guys actually here in Madison, just by the way the world works, And so it was very fun to do that and continuously hear from different people like, oh, this is how it worked in Colombia. Oh, this is how that didn't work here. This is what we tried over there, and it was just constantly all of this real world action. And so it was nice. So I'd wanted to go back to graduate school just to learn more skills and techniques for doing research originally. But the more I got into it, the more I was like, well, I just kind of want to be working in education and conservation a little bit more than research. So that's where it went. After that, it was kind of a natural progression. I went to University of Wisconsin because I had already spent a lot of time up here and got my PhD here. But that took forever because mostly the PhD was like a side job for me. And the real job was starting the Ceiba Foundation. So we founded the organization as a nonprofit in 1999. We started with just, a handful of donors and a handful of this and that and some ideas. And we started working in Ecuador. And our first project was to work with the local landowners that lived near Quito, had this huge piece of property, but like not two pennies to rub together. And they said, well, we're looking for an organization to help us. We want to make a ecotourism destination. We think people would pay to come see orchids. And we're like, oh, we're a little organization kind of looking for a project. And like, this is great. It was like the commercial where the person walks around the corner with the chocolate and the peanut butter and the one thing falls in the other. And you're like, oh, Reese's Pieces or whatever. So we're like, this is great. And we said, okay, well, so we talked to them for a long time and started a project down there. So the whole time I was in graduate school, we were doing conservation work. I mean, back to this idea of the guys in Paraguay. It's like, well, I don't need the degree to get started. I need it for my eventual goals, but we were doing stuff all along the way. So PhD took a long time, but I didn't really care because I was kind of doing what I wanted already.
Yeah. So looking back, do you still think that you need the PhD to do what you do or what you have done?
Some yes and some no. There's lots of work in research that you can do without an advanced degree. You can certainly do anything in conservation without an advanced degree. I mean, it's just, put your shoulder to the wheel. Mostly the solutions are fairly obvious. Don't cut down the forest, don't poison the lake, don't over harvest the fish. There's a lot we can learn all the time, but mostly it's relatively obvious, and which I think is actually a positive note. Like, I'm always interested in the idea, or I'm drawn to the idea that for the most part, the solutions for problems that people put their finger on, deforestation, overfishing, the solutions are there. Like, we mostly know what they are. It's just the implementation that's hard. And that's not to minimize that process, but getting people or governments or businesses or whatever to follow those solutions, that's sort of the challenging part. But the fact that they exist is a big leap forward, So part of that stuff, no, I didn't really need the degree, but I do really enjoy the process of environmental education. And particularly, I like teaching at the college level, or university level, whatever. So for the most part, a PhD was sort of a necessary thing. So in that sense, yeah, I'm pretty happy about it. And I think there's a lot of skills that you learn along the way in being with really high level peers and professors. So it was valuable, but I wouldn't do it again necessarily right now.
Fair. Well, you already did it.
Yeah. I have my partner, Catherine, who's a really accomplished botanist, is always like, oh, if I were to go back for another PhD, and I was like, stop right there. I'm not doing that. I got a lot of things I want to do, and a PhD isn't one of them. But yeah.
Fair. I want to take it back to actually starting the Ceiba Foundation. I mean, you're doing this in conjunction with getting your PhD, which is certainly a feat in of itself. What did that really look like? And would you go over what the Ceiba is? Because it's a really cool story.
Yeah, sure. So in reverse order, Ceiba, that's Ceiba. It's a tree that's widely distributed in the tropics. So Mexico, Costa Rica, Peru, Ecuador. It's related to the baobab. So if anybody knows what a baobab, those are those big, stocky looking, funny trees, mostly known from Madagascar. The Ceiba tree has a very umbrella-like architecture. So it's really big central column. And then all the branches start way up at the top like an umbrella and kind of come out horizontally. So it's a giant, majestic tree. I mean, they get to be 60 meters tall. So what is that? Almost not quite 200 feet, 180 feet tall. Yeah, maybe 200 feet. Huge, right? And then in those horizontal branches, the canopy of the umbrella, it's incredible habitat for all kinds of stuff. So there are orchids that live there, ferns, mosses, bromeliads, those are the things that look like the top of a pineapple. But tree frogs, birds, monkeys walk around up there, snakes, bats, like almost anything you can think of. So it's a really nice emblem for tropical diversity because it really holds all this diversity. And the first place it really caught our eye, myself and my partner Catherine were sort of the founders of Ceiba. We were working in Costa Rica, and in Costa Rica you find a very mixed landscape, a lot of human managed areas and a lot of little forest patches. And when people would cut forest for pasture or for bananas or whatever they were growing, very commonly they would leave the Ceiba tree behind. And when we started asking people about it, they said two things. First, the wood is no good, so that's just a pragmatic reason. But second, because they had sort of a sense of awe about it. There was almost this sense of a non-religious reverence for the tree, and people were like, I just couldn't bring myself to cut it because it's just so big and beautiful. So for us, it became this emblem, this kind of unpronounceable, I will say, emblem. People always say Ceiba and Cebu and stuff, and it's like, sorry, world, for giving you a name, that's very difficult to pronounce. But anyway, it was sort of this emblem of people just can't quite bring themselves to completely take nature down. You know, like if you have a big piece of forest and you live in Costa Rica, you know, and you have a family and you need to raise kids and your wife, you know, needs medicine and your mom needs an operation, like, are you going to cut some forest down and grow cows or corn or whatever? Like, of course, you know, and nobody can fault that person for making that decision. And yet they still will sometimes do it with this sense of like, wow, I should leave behind this, you know, emblem, this marker, this, you know, this character from the forest. So that was like our original drive. The more we read about it, then we found that like, wow, also it's got really big significance in Mayan mythology. I don't really work that much in Mexico, but the Mayan mythology was that the ceiba tree sort of was the pillar that separated the afterlife, which is the sky, right, the heaven, from the today world, the now world, which is the terrestrial part. And the vines and lianas, right, these big rope-like vines that hang down, were the pathway along which souls of the recently departed would ascend from our today terrestrial life up to the forever heaven life. So, and it's pretty, it has a lot of significance for lots of different people. So that was sort of the origin, like why we like that name.
Yeah. So what was it like starting a foundation then? What did that look like?
It was sort of seat of the pants, you know. I mean, we always just kind of did things the way that we thought they should be done. And people would be like, no, you should do it that way. We're like, yeah, that could have been good, but whatever. We just kind of did our own thing. So luckily in graduate school, when I was in Florida, I had a really good friend named Jan Sensimir. He's a very fine ecologist in his own right. And he had started his own foundation, which was unrelated. It was providing scholarships for students of Polish and American descent. And I was talking to him one day about this thing about Paraguay, and I'd seen these people and they do all this cool stuff. And then on the other hand, you know, the contrast was talking to all these grad students at Florida. Oh, I'm going to get a postdoc and then I'll make a difference in the world. And I was talking to Jan and like, man, I said, this doesn't really feel that good to me. And I kind of want to get going now. And he was just like, why don't you just make your own foundation? Just like that, you know, I'm like, oh my God, really? Like I always think the foundation's like MacArthur Foundation. You know, you have to have like $1 billion and a building with big giant columns in front of it and stained glass windows or whatever. And I was like, I don't know, really? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, how does it work? And he's like, well, I'll give you the name of this lawyer in Boston. And it's like $50. I'm like, what? So anyway, we started all this stuff. We downloaded, there was internet by then. So we downloaded some boilerplate bylaws and stuff like this. And we started the whole thing kind of rolling. And a funny story, because then we went to Panama. Both Kath and I got a job teaching a study abroad course in marine biology in Panama, in Bocas del Toro, which is the islands on the Caribbean side of Panama, considerably north of the Panama Canal. And so we went down there to teach, and with this guy who'd set up this program. And he was like, yeah, come down, I'll pay you a salary, buy your tickets. So we get down there. It was great fun. And we were in the water all the time, like learning ourselves, because I didn't really know a lot about marine biology. All my studies have been on land. I knew about toucans and insects and stuff. And I'm like, students are like, what fish is that? And I'm like, yeah, how would we find that out? You know, this kind of what professors do when they don't know, you know. And so anyway, we had a great time and everything was cool. And it was like this kind of poorly run study abroad program. Like they ran out of money. They had a car that got parked below the high tide line and then got swallowed by the ocean and whatever. And all this stuff is happening. Kath and I are just like, oh my God, like this is sort of terrible. Like we could do this a lot better. We didn't know anything, but we were like, yeah, I think we could do this better, you know? And then one day we got a little message and we went down, we were standing, I remember it so clearly, in the middle of Bocas del Toro, back in the day when they had phones in phone booths, right? So for those of you that don't know, a phone booth is a small vertical rectangle made of glass with a phone inside of it. And you stand inside this thing. It's like a coffin on end, right? And two of us are crammed in there. And we get a phone call from Jeffrey M. Hurwitz, Esquire, the lawyer in Boston, you know. And he's like, hey, everybody, like, congratulations. But he was going on. And we're like, Jeffrey, it's like 150 degrees inside of this glass terrarium that we're standing in the midday sun in Panama, sweating puddles at the bottom. Like, can we kind of get to the point? And he's like, oh yeah. Okay. The point is, like, Ceiba Foundation is legally incorporated now, like whatever that was, June 7th, 1997. And we're like, oh, this is great. You know, so we stepped out of this inferno of a phone booth. And that was kind of the actual starting point. So at the same time, we had like, oh, we found out the foundation is legit, is legal now. And we realized, wow, we really like teaching study abroad courses and we can do it better than this scene. So that was 97. And by 1999, we were already teaching our own study abroad summer course in Ecuador. And it all started to kind of unfold from there.
Amazing. Do you come up with all your own curriculum then?
We do, but we have a really nice partnership with the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. And so they're very supportive of study abroad in general. They really like to get a lot of students to study abroad. And so they've made this whole process as easy as it can be to match up courses that a student would take overseas with the credits that they should get, back at home. So if I teach them, plant biology 101 in Belize, it should cover most of what they would have gotten on campus. So they're ready for the next class. So in that sense, we have a certain responsibility to the students, trajectory through or pathway through their studies. And so we try to tick a bunch of those boxes, but a lot of it, because we're in the tropics and we're in these cool places, a lot of it is like, okay, let's go and learn, we're like, okay, everybody, this year, this time you're going to learn 26 families of plants and 15 bird calls and learn how to identify, 40 species of birds. And they're all like with their mouths open, and we're like, yeah, don't worry. Like, and then literally, by a couple of weeks, well, maybe a month later, they can do all of this. And it's sort of a joy to challenge students to learn stuff that's hard, but not impossible. And then, you just put in effort and joy and enthusiasm and curiosity. And then all of a sudden you find, wow, I do know 26 families of plants and I know all these birds and I know all these bird calls and stuff like that. Sounds like an amazing program. Well, I mean, we like to think so, but yeah, we try. I mean, and it shifts all the time. I will say all these programs have been really dynamic, so, there's, for example, I think that students today are more culturally interested than maybe they were 15 years ago, just to pick a date. So 15 years ago, we could kind of say like, we're not really going to do much about looking at Ecuadorian culture. We're just going to spend as much time as possible in the forest and look at, liverworts and orchids and, whatever, poisonous frogs. But, to students' credit, they're like, hey, we've come all this way. We're in Ecuador. We want to know about Ecuadorian culture. So our program has really, evolved through time. Now we have lots of Ecuadorian staff that lead stuff. We interact a lot with landowners and farmers and other scientists, and people get much more of a window into, what's going on down there. Do you ever look at the relationship between the Ecuadorian people and like the plants that you're studying or the birds and just kind of how that's changed or evolved or remained the same over time? Yeah, we do. Not surprisingly, that's always a real big topic of interest for students. Mm-hmm. So in most of the places that we go, either guides that work permanently at some of the research stations that we visit, but come from the cultures that live there, or just people, farmers, locals that live in these places, will have their own uses for all kinds of stuff in the forest, and that ranges from simple things like, oh, this makes a good fence post and that makes a bad fence post. Mm. There's one that's called bruja, for example. Bruja means witch in Spanish, and it's a little tree, but it grows in multiple stems, and each one's about the size of a baseball bat in diameter. So it's perfect size for fence posts. But if you hit it with a machete, it's so hard that the machete bounces back at you. And so if you were to do it in exactly the wrong way, it would cut you. And that's why they call it bruja. Like it's the witch plant because it defends itself and cuts you when you try to cut it, But that's a plant that's really, really good for, if you do it carefully, for making fence posts because it's really, really hard wood. And then people use tropical native plants for food. So we eat stuff all the time. We're like giving students things and be like, we have this rule that comes from a friend of mine named Vlastimil Sak in Ecuador, which is don't eat anything that your professor doesn't eat. And so, we'll give students, like, people will come up to me and they'll be like, oh, look at this berry. Can I eat this? And I'm like, I don't know. Or yeah, totally. Like if it's a fig, you can eat it or whatever. And there's plants that are they're related to philodendrons. They're all in the Araceae family, but like philodendrons, Jack in the Pulpit, peace lily, these are all things in the elephant ears are all in that group. And they defend themselves with what are called calcium oxalate crystals. So they're basically just like little fiberglass shards that are inside the plant. And this is so like, a spectacle bear or a raccoon or whatever that might walk by and chew on it sort of feels like they got a mouthful of glass splinters. It's not poisonous. It just hurts, right? And then they spit it out and go off their merry way, And so I was on a course with Lasty one time, and he went up to one of these big giant plants that's got this stuff in abundance, and he's cutting off little discs of it. So the discs look, for all the world, like a little a little disc of a cucumber, like they're that color, and he's handing it out to all the students, his students. And I'm like looking at him going, that's not good, and he had told them like an hour before, don't eat anything your professor doesn't eat. So he's like, yeah, go ahead and chew it. So they're all chewing on this. And I'm like, maybe you know something that I don't know. And then sure enough, they all start being like, ow, 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 and spitting and holding their tongues out, kind of comically, very funny. I mean, it's not horrible. It's just kind of uncomfortable. And then they're looking at him and a few Spanish curses that I learned that day. And Vlasti was like, what did I tell you at the beginning of the hike? And they're like, what? With their tongue out, oh, what did you tell us? And he's like, don't eat anything your professor didn't eat. And they're like, what? So basically poisoned them with this plant. So I do this all the time to my students now, except I'll eat it first just to prove that you can do it, because whatever. So those are comical examples. But yeah, I mean, your question was more about the way people use forests. I mean, in the Amazon in particular, which is like this awesome pharmacopoeia, if you come from a culture that knows about it, we're constantly teaching students. I shouldn't say we, the guides and locals are teaching students about, okay, this thing is used to dye, cloth. This is used as a cure for snake bite. We get students with little ailments. They get bug bites or ant bites or whatever, and they'll go find vines to help them and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of that kind of stuff that's really fun to interact with.
Yeah. It's a whole fascinating world for me.
Yeah. I mean, if I had time to go to another PhD, I would do one in ethnobotany.
Ethnobotany is fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Why orchids? I know you mentioned when you were starting the Ceiba Foundation that you kind of found naturally a project that fit within the foundation's guidelines, and then it just happened to be orchids. And then you ended up writing a book. So why orchids? And then what inspired you to actually write an entire book about it?
Yeah, this is like a lot of things that happen to us. It's like you're walking along and there's a hole in the ground and you just fall into it. And at the bottom of the hole, you're like, whoa, it's really cool down here. So that's kind of what happened. We were driving around Ecuador and we bumped into this family, and that whole story unfolded where we're like, okay, let's collaborate. And we signed a conservation easement with them to protect the property. In exchange for them protecting it, we invested and built a lot of infrastructure that was all driven by donations and grants and stuff. And some of the grants came from orchid societies, because the driving force that the family, this is a family called the Lima family, they already had the idea that people are fascinated by orchids. They had seen some busloads of like German tourists, I think, who got out and they were like, this is cool, and they were taking pictures of orchids and stuff like that. And they thought, well, maybe we can turn this into a business. And we were like, I think you can, because they're only 45 minutes from Quito, and tour companies, want to go there, and people from Quito, it's just a nice day trip. But we didn't know anything about orchids. I mean, at the time I was a bird and bug guy. My partner, Catherine, was a botanist, but she didn't really work on orchids. So we started learning more about them, and then hired people and invited people to come and do surveys. And so I started looking at the place and finding some rare stuff and a lot of diversity. That's at about 7,000 feet of elevation. So it's what you call cloud forest or tropical montane forest, really misty and mossy, and it's perfect orchid habitat. So there's hundreds of species there. So we started doing that, and you can just walk around the trails and find them. We also helped the family to build a little botanical garden that you can just walk around. Even people with sort of limited mobility, it's not going up and down mountains, but just walk around this flat little garden. And they would find orchids that had fallen out of the trees and mount them there. So we all started learning about, well, which orchids like to be mounted up high and down low, and which ones have pretty flowers and all that. So that's kind of where we just literally fell into it. It was like, that's what they wanted to do. And it seemed like a good idea. And people kept coming and taking pictures of orchids. We're like, all right, great. So we called it the El Pahuma Orchid Reserve, or they called it that, I should say. And so then I was kind of working on this and thinking about it, and visiting orchid societies to raise money for the project, and kind of going around and doing a little, slideshows and talking to people about, here's some success stories from the tropics, And I started thinking about it. I'm a bird watcher, was sort of first and foremost. And I was thinking, there's no such thing as like a Peterson's guide, the sort of original fundamental guide to birds for orchids, right? And a Peterson's guide is like a thing you can pick up, and there's bunches of kinds of these guides now, and pick it up and flip through it and be like, oh yeah, I saw a woodpecker. And then you just look at some pictures and it's like, oh, it's that one. And then you read some cool stuff about it. Oh, woodpeckers have a tongue that wraps all the way around the back of their head to cushion their brain when they pound against the tree, and they eat bugs and they climb up, whatever, and all this kind of stuff. So they're great for identification guides, and they're packed with like really fun little pieces of information, ecological and whatever. And I was looking and looking and looking, and there wasn't a book like this. I thought, well, we made a gift shop and like, well, let's put an orchid guide in the gift shop. And there isn't one. They're either like really big and super expensive kind of coffee table books, or they were how to grow orchids, or they were botanical and all black and white and really like, super, the Scaphosepalpetalum is upside, invert, like nobody's going to understand. So I, out of some sense of lunacy, I was like, well, why don't I write a book on orchids? And I started talking to the people at Cornell Press, and I was like, I don't know a damn thing about orchids, but I have two friends who do, and we'd like to write a book about orchids. And they were like, all right. So that was sort of a leap of faith on their part, for which I'm eternally grateful. But anyway, so me and two orchid experts wrote a book on orchids that was meant to be kind of a Peterson's guide to the big groups of orchids. So that's orchids of tropical America. It covers 120 broad groups of orchid. There's about 500 pictures in there of different species, and tries to talk about like where you can find them and, what they look like, what they do, some of the interesting natural history, like who pollinates them, which ones, like, vanilla is an orchid, for example. And when you take really natural vanilla ice cream with the little teeny black flecks in it, those black flecks are orchid seeds. And vanilla, they call it a bean, but it's technically a pod or a capsule for all you botanical jargon people out there. And that's, so that's the one orchid that we actually make a food out of for the most part. So I tried to tell all these cool stories, and I found that writing the stories part was kind of the funnest part for me. That's probably not actually a word, but the most fun part for me. And anyway, so that was kind of the history of the orchid book.
Yeah. And it was so much fun, you decided to write another one. Could you
Pretty
tell?
much. I mean, yeah, Cornell Press said, that was fun, and let's do another book. And I was like, let's do a book of like orchids of Borneo, because I was hoping to get like a free trip to Borneo. And Cornell Press is like, no, we're not.
We're done with orchids.
Yeah, they're like, the number of people that like orchids is small already, and then the number of people that go to, they go to Borneo is tiny, and the Venn diagram is like 2 people. So we're not going to do this. So I was like, okay. And by that time, because of all so that's about 6 years ago that book came out. But by that time, I'd been starting to do a lot of marine biology. Our semester, our courses in Ecuador had kind of grown from short summer courses to full length semester programs in spring semester. That program included marine biology, because we're like, well, we're in Ecuador, we should totally take people to Galapagos. And if you go to Galapagos, you should go underwater because it's awesome. And so we started learning a whole bunch about marine biology in order to be able to teach it, and just because it's so cool. And the more I found out about it, the more it's like, oh my God, there's like a million cool stories about fish underwater. Like everybody knows that cheetahs go 60 miles an hour, and everybody knows that a giraffe has a long neck to be able to reach the leaves at the top of the tree. But all that same stuff is happening like times 1,000 underwater. I mean, a sailfish can go 60 miles an hour, and things have long necks to jab into, there's all kinds of cool stuff. So the more I found out about it, I was like, wow, there's just tons of cool stories. Maybe I'll write a book about all of these. So that's kind of where that one started. Is just, let's go, look at all the extraordinary things that fish do and how they kind of interact with the human world.
Yes. Which is something I am always very interested in exploring more, is how we affect the world around us, specifically the ocean. So I have a happy little copy of your book right here. Let me see some of my notes. I really did enjoy the book a lot. One of the things that struck me right out the gate, and you kind of wrapped up with it a little bit at the end as well, is you brought in how connected we are with the ocean. So it starts off with the doldrums and these like beautiful deserts in the ocean at the equator, where the water's crystal, like beautiful blue, but there's no life there. And there's no life there because there's no nutrient input from land, and how it all is impacted, right? You talk about the Mississippi Delta and how it all fuels the Gulf of Mexico. Would you share a little bit more about how it's just really all connected?
Yeah, happily. And thanks for putting all your little stickers in the book. That's the sign of somebody who's actually reading it. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think, so I live in Wisconsin. I grew up mostly in Chicago. I'm pretty far from the ocean, and lots of people live near the ocean, but lots of people don't. But the connections are pretty tremendous. I mean, one little simple one is that half of all the oxygen that's made on planet Earth is made by plankton. So little green algae basically plants that are floating around in the ocean. And, so every 2 breaths you take, one of them came from the sea, statistically on average kind of thing. Right. So there's that. You mentioned that that a lot of the really productive parts of the world where big fisheries happen, so off the Louisiana coast, all that sort of Gulf fisheries that can be everything from salmon to tuna to, all the shrimp fisheries that are down there. A lot of that is because those places are super productive because of all the nutrients that come down the Missouri, the Wisconsin, in the Mississippi River, and then all the way down and come out at the Mississippi Delta. The same thing is true in lots of other parts of the world where you get a lot of those nutrients. And in general, the most productive parts of the ocean, like the parts of the ocean that produce the most tons of fish, are pretty close to shore. Like there's some kinds of fish like tuna and marlin, swordfish, people hunt for way out in the open sea, but the vast majority of fishing happens really close to the coast. The biggest fishery in the world is the Peruvian anchovy fishery. So people know that from like pizzas or Caesar salads or whatever, but it's the number one fishery in the world. More pounds of anchovy are caught off of the Peruvian coast and sort of the northern Chilean coast than any other fish on planet Earth. And if that's right there by the coast. So that's partly because of runoff from the land and partly because of a big upwelling that happens where deep ocean water comes rolling up to the surface. But I think kind of more culturally, the interactions between land and sea have just been super interesting. I mean, like Sigmund Freud wrote his first paper about fish. America was discovered by probably Basque fishermen. I mean, probably the Vikings were there first, but the Basque fishermen were there for a long, long time. And when the French got there, they were like, wow, look at all these boats. And then when Columbus got there, he's like, I discovered America. It's like, yeah, well, probably not, but whatever. You keep telling yourself that. So there's that kind of stuff. And I don't know, there's just a ton of really interesting ways that, that people on land are connected to water, discoveries that are made in the ocean, connect back to, and basically like all life on Earth started in the ocean. That's probably the most compelling hypothesis. I mean, I was just reading a thing, I just saw this yesterday or the day before, that there's a big giant telescope, I think it's the James Webb, and they're looking for life on other planets, right? And so they found a planet, a lot of them, and this one is 124 light years away. So it said beyond the reach of humans. I'm like, yeah, I think so. So 124 light years away, I don't remember what it's called. It's like planet 1b2l7 or whatever. And they got some spectral signature, some form of the color of the light that's coming from that planet that could be the sign of what's called DMS. And DMS is dimethyl sulfide. It's the smell of the sea, and it's given off by plankton that are some of the same plankton that make oxygen. But the idea that we're looking 124 light years away across the galaxy to see a planet that maybe has a little bit of plankton gas, and that's how we're saying like, whoa, that might be life. I just think that's super duper cool. And then, as a way to find life, they're basically finding the ocean. They're not finding like, oh, somebody also made a sitcom over there and now we're getting
Yeah, the source of life is the ocean that they're looking for. I like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that just came up, I think, yesterday.
Oh, that's a fun way to think about that. One of the things that you mentioned that I really liked is that over half of the continent of the U.S., or nearly half of the continent, drains into the Mississippi Delta. And so this, for good or bad, right? We provide a lot of nutrients for the ocean, but that just means that everything that we are using, whether it's toxic or not, also goes into the Mississippi Delta. So, and that fuels all the food cycles. And I thought that was a really interesting point to make. I do want to pivot. You came to Florida, and I have to bring that piece up. Right. You did a really great job of telling science. I felt like part of it was like, oh, okay, I have definitely read this in some of my science textbooks. And then storytelling. So you brought the book into Florida to study tarpon, or tell a story about tarpon, and you went out with a fishing guide. Is that a true story? Because it very much sounded like it in the book.
I'm a pretty honest person, so I'll say no, it isn't. I've read a lot about tarpon fishing. I know some fishers are new in Florida, some tarpon fishers. Okay. And yeah, I was just trying to weave, for people that haven't read the book, it starts with a guy kind of fumbling around the dark to get going fishing. And then he gets out on a fishing boat and he's got a buddy that's fishing and they're tarpon fishing. So you use the motor for a while, but then you start poling. And tarpon, for a bunch of different reasons, can be found in shallow waters. They mouth breathe, so you can see them at the surface. They're real feisty fighters when you hook them, and they leap spectacularly in the air, with scales glistening and all this, sort of the classic kind of angler, dream to see this. And so, yeah, I tried frequently through the book. I think mostly every chapter kind of opens with some kind of a story about a person or a place or a thing that's related to people, just to kind of remind people all the time that we have all these different connections. But no, I would like to go tarpon fishing. If anybody out there wants to contact me, my phone number is, but yeah, it was something that I sort of dreamed up.
Perfect. I love that. Well, if you actually do, I know a lot of local guides that'd be happy to take you out. But tarpon are amazing. They're one of my favorite fish to watch in the water because, yeah, you go to these little alcoves of the lagoon and in the morning, and it's glass calm, and all you see is the tarpon rolling, and they're silvery scales, light, glistening in the sunlight, and they're amazing. One of the things that you highlighted in the book that I think is really fun to bring up is their resilience to salinity changes. So their kidneys are able to expel excess salt, and then their gills can actually hold the salt in when they need to in low salinity situations. I thought that was a fascinating bit.
Yeah, most fish live way out at sea, or even just marginally out at sea, where the salinity is basically the same all the time. And except for things like salmon that do the real extreme, where they go from 100% saltwater to 100% freshwater, and they have all these adaptations to deal with that. But tarpon are in this interesting little middle zone where they're in these estuaries and near shore environments where when there's a lot of rain or it's low tide, then you're in a more freshwater environment. And when you're in a freshwater environment, you are saltier than the ocean, and kind of like a dry sponge absorbs water, you absorb water, it gets sucked into your body as a fish, and you become kind of all bloated and watery. And so you have to try to get rid of that water somehow. So they have very hardworking kidneys that are able to do that. And then when the reverse happens, when it's dry season, there's not a lot of fresh water coming down, and then it's high tide, then you're in a salty environment. And now the exact opposite happens. When the outside is saltier than you, then you start to dehydrate and water flows out of you. So they're in this situation that very, very few fish can tolerate. And as you say, they have very specialized kidneys to be able to eliminate those salts from their body. They do it across the gills as well. And are able to do this, just from 1 hour to the next in order to stay at about the same balance. I kind of refer to some of these things as force fields because it's an invisible protection that other fish just can't get past. And, one of the other things that happens in those areas, because they're shallow, they get pretty warm. Overnight, all the oxygen is being used up. So it becomes a really low oxygen environment, and most fish would just suffocate. Mm-hmm. And so tarpon and a few other things have this ability to come to the surface and gulp a gulp of air. So that's almost like another force field, in that very few fish can tolerate getting in and dealing with all that funny salinity or tolerate this low oxygen. And so tarpon have evolved to be this perfectly adapted creature that can not only make this place, be safe in this place, but make it a super productive home for themselves, hunt, breed. All that rolling is part of the breathing as well. Breeding. And so, they excel in this environment.
Awesome. There's I wrote down so many nuggets to cover, but I don't think we've said it yet. So it's The Marlin's Fiery Eye is the name of Joe's new book. And would you tell the story of how the title came to be? I had forgotten this fun factoid about marlins and swordfish and how they have a fiery eye. So that was fun to relearn that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I should say, well, you have to buy the book to find out. That's what I'm supposed to do. But, I like telling stories.
There's a lot of great stories in here that's worth buying the book for. How about that? We're only covering 2 or 3.
Right. The Marlin's Fiery Eye. I just think it's a cool It was a very cool discovery. It's been discovered a couple different times in a few different fishes. Essentially, marlin and a lot of other fish like swordfish and even tuna will hunt near the surface of the ocean where there's light and productivity and lots of little fish to eat. But they also will dive down into deeper waters because little fish, not surprisingly, don't love being hunted by a marlin. So if they can avoid being seen by going down to where it's a little bit darker, get out of the battle zone, then they do that. So you get lots of fish that are down 200, 300, 400 feet, maybe even as deep as 1,000 feet. So when you dive down there, anybody that's dived down into any body of water more than your body length, it gets cold, right? As soon as you get underwater. And this happens in the ocean too. So when these fish dive, they get colder, right? And the fish that are down there are cold, so they're sort of lethargically moving around. And all these animals are visual predators. They're seeing their prey fish, they accelerate after them and chase them down, swallow them. So the better you can see, the better you can hunt. And they have bigger eyes, which is real common in things that go to like big eye tuna has a very relatively large eye because they dive. Marlins have a big eye. Some swordfish have eyes like the size of a softball, these huge things. And so they can see better just for that reason alone. It's just a bigger, light collecting device. But there's a feature of an eye that's called the flicker rate. And a flicker rate is kind of like how fast does your eye take pictures of the world, right? So say you watch, a football game and a guy's diving for the end zone, they switch to a camera that takes, 100 frames per second. So you can see like, ding, 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 does the football cross the line or, anything like this, right? And so if your eye takes pictures slowly, then a fish darting across your field of vision, you maybe only see 1 or 2 pictures of it before it leaves. And it's very hard to follow that fish. It's hard to figure out its speed and its angle and all that stuff. But it turns out that if you can keep your eye warm, it greatly increases your ability to take pictures very, very quickly. So marlin and swordfish and a bunch of other species have this blanket, essentially a heating blanket that wraps around the back of each eye. It's plumbed with directly to the heart. So it gets hot blood coming straight out of the heart. That blood is heated by their musculature. And that blood heats up this heating blanket so the eyeball can be as much as 10 or 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding water. So they dive down there and they've got these like hot little goggles, that other fish don't have. And they can now see much better than if they didn't have that. And so they are much more successful at hunting. A fish that is sprinting across their field of vision, where if they didn't have the blanket, they might see it 2 or 3, images captured. They now see 10 or 20 images captured. They can easily calculate the direction and the speed. They turn, they whip their big giant tails with their powerful flank muscles, chase after it and hunt it. So that I like that whole idea that I just think there's all these cool adaptations that fish have to pressures that are a little bit unfamiliar to us, like being in deep, cold, dark water. And yet nature has sort of hit on these amazing solutions, like having a hot eyeball to help you to feed yourself better.
The fiery eye. Well, there's so much more in this book. We've got hermaphroditic parrotfish, and we go to mangroves and, dermodenticles in the sharks and how people are using that in biomimicry solutions. And there's just so much. So I definitely recommend listeners check out Joe's book. But before we wrap up, I have a series of questions that I like to ask at the end of each episode. If you were given a blank check for one project or projects up to 3, what would you use the money for?
Can I start a bowling league in Wisconsin? No, I'm just kidding. I assume you mean marine biology, conservation stuff. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, right? Because I run a foundation and we do a lot of conservation projects. But to be honest, I would use it for funding a marine reserve that had sustainable fishing permitted in it. And so I see attempts to do that in Belize, for example. So we started out talking about the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, and we work there and have friends in the Belize fisheries department, and they're all really smart, really hardworking people. But the funding is so limited for them that even though they know what needs to be done, they just don't have the support available to be able to properly educate fishermen, provide gear buyback, funding to train people to do interdiction when people enter waters and fish out of season and things like that. So, and I think that in general, part of what my research in the book has shown and just my experience is that the ocean is like amazingly resilient. The primary pressure in oceans, there are things like pollution and plastics and climate change. Those are all real and serious. But by far, the primary pressure in oceans is overfishing. And if we can control overfishing and where that has been done, it's nothing short of stunning how quickly oceans recover, fish populations, coral health, water clarity, stuff like that. So I would use the check to establish a marine reserve in which local people could fish and fish sustainably and have good, meaningful employment and produce delicious, healthy protein for people on land, but to do it in a way that was sustainable and successful.
It's a good use of the money.
Yeah, better than a bowling league. There's a lot of those already.
One of the questions I like to ask is, how do you keep the hope or the connection? Often when you're entrenched in conservation or, policy, you can get a little jaded in seeing things. So how do you maintain optimism in what you do and what you see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think to be a biologist or anybody who goes out in nature is sort of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I'm privileged to be able to see these amazing creatures, interactions, plants that the planet has on offer. But at the same time, I'm also maybe more painfully aware than the average person of what it is we are losing and the rate at which we are losing it. I go to places in Ecuador that's like, whoa, that used to be a forest, and then it really brings tears to my eyes to think about, like, man, I wonder what happened to the birds that were living there. I wonder what happened to the bumblebee, the frog, that was living there. So that it is really challenging. But I often think about, any struggle that's difficult is a struggle worth engaging in. Like, if it was easy, it would have already been solved, And I think back to people that engage in like civil rights movement or the, women's suffrage movement. Like, these were struggles that lasted, more than a single person's lifespan. And if people, permitted themselves to just give up, then it wouldn't have happened. And so in my line of work, and frankly, in anybody's area where you're committed to a cause, it doesn't have to be nature. I think there's that sense of being able to stay committed to the process and allow yourself the freedom to enjoy the joys and beauties of what you're trying to protect. Whether that's a language or a culture or a bunch of fishes. My friend Heather Swan, who's a writer up here, refers to the courage that's necessary to allow yourself to simultaneously love and enjoy what's beautiful out there while accepting the challenges that it's currently facing. So part of that is just this kind of personal calibration of allow yourself to be sad and allow yourself to be happy. You can do those things. The other part of it, I think, really is that, especially in the oceans, I really do believe that there's a lot of reason for optimism. I think that the broad understanding for a lot of people that are looking at it is like, oh, the oceans are overfished and we shouldn't eat fish at all. And that's not really true anymore. Depending on how you count it, the majority of fish that are landed are from sustainable stocks and sustainable fisheries. There are still a bunch that need work, but there are a lot of fish out there that are being sustainably harvested. So that's, sustainable food every year for people that eat fish, sustainable jobs every year for people that not only catch fish, but ship them and, sell them at fish counters and all that, and sustainable populations for the fishes themselves and the roles that they play, in the environment. And so, and the nice thing for me is that, like we were saying before, is that those solutions are generally mostly out there, ways of managing fisheries, ways of managing, catch limits and things like that work. They really have worked in places where they were implemented. So, like, back to the blank check idea, if you have the funding to actually be able to implement these known solutions, they really do pay off. So marine reserves, marine protected areas work, like fisheries controls work, and they have worked. And so I do just actually feel like an informed optimism that the solutions are in front of us. The oceans are incredibly resilient. And as we continue to place pressure and put solutions into place, that the oceans will continue to rebound and support us as we support them.
I agree. And I think that people are capable of holding that sadness of what's happened and the hope of what's to come. We can hold the duality, and it's just focusing on even the small wins or the small joys and the things that are beautiful. And it doesn't always have to be in the ocean. Even being able to go into your own backyard and appreciating something little is a win. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the season here in Wisconsin for woolly bears, the little fuzzy orange and black, striped caterpillars, to be out walking around. And everyone I see one, I'm like, it's a woolly bear, and it's like, whatever, I see them all the time, but they're adorable. They're just chugging along their little lives and fuzzy and kind of cute. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that whatever it is that inspires a person to take some joy out of their day, maybe it's classical music, maybe it's a painting on your wall, maybe it's a sports team, maybe it's the flowers outside your window, whatever it is, like, time is sort of short, and like we all deserve to have some joy in our lives, and the things that you enjoy, like, go enjoy them. And you don't have to feel, I don't really believe in the idea that you should be remorseful about enjoying something that is also under threat. Right. Enjoy it and deal with the threats. Like, I think we can do those things.
I agree. Which leads me nicely into, at the end of each episode, I like to leave the audience with a conservation ask to go forth and bring into the world. What would you like my audience to take from your episode today?
Wow, great. Boy, there's so many. I think so. That's a good question. It's hard to start, right? Let's just start in one place. Eat fish from good fisheries that support good fishermen or good fishers, fisher people. Because you're supporting jobs, you're supporting fisheries that are well managed. And as we gradually, support those fisheries, other fisheries that are not well managed will get the hint and become more well managed. So I'm always amazed by how many just regular old, butcher counters and fish counters in just normal old supermarkets increasingly show little tags that say, sustainably caught, or this is from here, or this is this kind of fish. So I would encourage, I guess, first thing is educate yourself about what kinds of fish and fisheries, are sustainable and worthwhile to support. There's great organizations that do that. So Seafood Watch is obviously one of them. It's an app and a website, and you can look stuff up there that tells you what kinds of fish and what kinds of fishing techniques are worth being supported. There's an organization called the MSC, which is the Marine Stewardship Council, that has like a blue check mark that's kind of their logo. And they systematically review fisheries and put that little seal of approval. So it's kind of like the organic seal of approval sort of thing. So go ahead and support fisheries. And, even if you only eat fish once a month, like, okay, fine. But then try to do it if you can and support a sustainable fishery. So that's one. Two is go see some fish. Whether that's like go in snorkeling if you have the opportunity, that's obviously a stretch for some people, but if you can go snorkel or scuba dive or just stick your head in the water, like see fish and just watch them for a while. They're so cool. They do all these really fun little things. Go to an aquarium, take your kids to an aquarium. If your kid's in school and they say, oh, we need some chaperones to go to the aquarium, like sign up, because they need you. And the aquariums are so cool. They're really great. So go see fish. I mean, they're just really, really neat. I think people, get turned on by looking at, toucans and lions and giraffes and stuff. And so go get excited about fish. That's cool. And then I think that's the third one is, support marine conservation organizations. So in the back of the book, there's a big long list of marine conservation organizations that range from research to education to straight up, habitat protection. So you can pick from those. They're easy to find online. Oceana is a great one. There's a ton of others. And all those organizations are like Ceiba Foundation. They all live and do the things that they do and fight the good fight all the time if they are supported with donations and assistance. So yeah, go help a marine conservation organization to make the sea a safer place and a healthier place for all planet Earth.
Perfect. If listeners want to find you, connect with you, learn more about the Ceiba Foundation or your book, Marlin's Fiery Eye, where's the best place to do so?
Thank you. Ceiba Foundation is CEIBA.org. So go to Ceiba.org and you can see about our research programs, our conservation programs, our education programs there. So that's a nice background on what we do. The book is available anywhere. Marlin's Fiery Eye at Cornell Press is the producer, the publisher, I should say. You can get it at Powell's, Abe's, Amazon, your local bookseller. If you want to read more about it, you can look at my website. So it's Joe Meisel, JoeMeisel.com. And you can see, excerpts from the book and samples of the illustrations. And then there's links there to buy it as well.
Perfect. I'll put a link to all of that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Joe, thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed chatting with you today.
Oh, Cara, thank you very much for the invitation. It was nice to spend an hour with you and your listeners, who I can't see, but I assume we're there somewhere. And thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure. I mean, I wrote a book to tell people stories about fish, so I'm always happy to talk stories about fish. I just think they're really cool and people should know more about them.
Have you ever wanted to explore the underwater realm but are unsure about how to get dive certified? I've got you covered. With efficiency and a dash of humor, my ebook, Scuba for Beginners, takes what you need to know to get in the water and distills it down to easily digestible chunks. In it, I cover the gear you need to actually get dive certified, decode which dive agency is best for you, and the number one thing to look out for when you're getting certified. As an added bonus, the guide includes tutorials on skills you'll learn during the certification process and the secret to getting certified in 2 different places. Scuba for Beginners will leave you confident in how to become certified and ready to dive in. Scuba for Beginners is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and my website, caragracemusia.com. Just click the link in the show notes and get started today. Thank you for listening to today's show. I'd love to hear any insight you've gleaned. Leave a comment in the show notes or send me an email over at caragracemusia.com. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review and, of course, share with your friends. If you want more resources for creating a life of purpose and meaning, plus personal insight from me that I just don't share anywhere else, join me at caragracemusia.com and sign up for email updates. Keep after your dreams and making waves in your community. One person can make a difference. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast.